Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Fable II for Xbox 360. This is a hack-and-slash action-adventure game masquerading as an action role-playing game developed by Lionhead Studios and published by Microsoft exclusively for Xbox 360 in October of 2008. It is, of course, the sequel to the original Fable, or Fable the Lost Chapters, depending on which version you're more familiar with. They're basically the same game, just one has a bit more content than the other. And Fable II was released to a huge amount of praise. In fact, it ended up getting a couple of Game of the Year awards, which kind of boggled my mind. But that's more for when I get into the story and the gameplay part of this review. Basically, the consensus was that Fable 2 was as good, if not better, than the original Fable. If you guys have seen my review of the original Fable, you know that I really didn't like Fable. But I can actually put that aside, because let's face it, the original Fable had a few good ideas in it, it just wasn't well executed at all, and it didn't deliver on any of the hype that was built up around it, because, let's face it, Peter Molyneux always promises way too much and never delivers on it. I went into this thing with a fairly reserved mentality. I knew what the original Fable was like, but I was putting that aside and giving Fable 2 a chance to speak on its own merits and its own disadvantages. Contrary to popular belief, I do not go into games wanting to hate them. I don't know where people get that idea. I don't go into a game wanting to hate it. I go into every single game wanting to enjoy it. Whether or not that actually happens is something else entirely. So let's go ahead and delve right into Fable 2 and find out what exactly it did. Did I end up enjoying this more than the original Fable, or did something else entirely happen? Now, as far as presentation goes, you do have to keep one really big thing in mind. This game was exclusive to the Xbox 360. It was very limited in the hardware department. And it really shows. Low-res textures abound in this thing. And even if the textures weren't really low-res, it still has other problems, like the weird filtering that goes over this thing. It looks like someone smeared Vaseline all over the screen, and even after that, there are still tons of jagged edges everywhere, and it just looks awful when you get down to it. Now, of course, I am playing this now on a 1080p monitor. When I started the game up, I was playing it on a CRT television, and even on that, it didn't look very good. I mean, even compared to other Xbox 360 games, it just looks average at best, mostly fairly mediocre in terms of actual visual quality. The art style is what elevates that a lot, but then you still have the problems of it just not having high visual quality to match up to its rather solid art style. So while it doesn't look good, at least it's bright and colorful and mostly kind of cartoony, and it fits the game pretty well. And then there's the sound design, which generally is better than the visuals. Sound effects generally work quite well, and in particular the gun sounds are actually kind of beefy, oddly enough. The music is pretty much what you would expect, a lot of very obvious fantasy-style music that's pretty good quality and generally works well for the game, but unfortunately is just completely forgettable. And then there's the voice acting, which generally is pretty damn good. They have a pretty solid cast, and a lot of it is played up to be kind of ridiculous, so it ends up working well in the game's favor, although sometimes characters can be really annoying. But that's more a fault of how they wrote it and how they directed it than the actual performance, I think. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. The story in this is that you play as someone who will eventually become known as the hero of Bowerstone, but when you're younger, you're known as Sparrow, and unlike in the original Fable, you can actually select your gender this time around, and change your appearance to some degree. But you start off the game living in poverty with your older sister, Rose, and of course you dream of living in luxury with Lord Lucian at Castle Fairfax, and after messing with a box that is supposed to grant wishes according to the person selling it to you, you end up being escorted to Castle Fairfax, at which point you meet with Lord Lucian. You find out that you are actually the descendant of the hero of Oakvale from the original Fable game, keeping of course in mind that this is set about 500 years after the events of the original Fable. And the real crux of the plot is that you are destined to bring down Lord Lucian and his attempts to rebuild the Tattered Spire, which is supposed to grant him ridiculous amounts of power. And you need to gather 3 other heroes, the heroes of strength, will, and skill, that will help you to defeat Lord Lucian and restore goodness and peace and such to Albion. Unfortunately for the game, it does an absolutely terrible job at making you give a crap about anything. The plot is simplistic and at times even feels like a rehash of what was going on in the original Fable, and you completely lose interest in what's going on with the main plot very, very quickly, which is kind of a problem because this game's actually fairly linear. You do have side quests and you do have some exploration to do, but the way the game's designed doesn't really let you treat it as side content that you can just kind of stumble upon and do things at your leisure. Instead, you actively have to look for side quests to do because they're the only way you can get a huge amount of renown all at once. Now you may be wondering what that is. It's an arbitrary number that the game uses to determine whether or not you can continue. I'm not joking. The plot grinds to a screeching halt several times and requires you to go do side quests and other side content in order to generate an arbitrary number of renown in order to continue the plot. And it's at that point you realize the side quests aren't really side quests. What they are instead are secondary quests, things that are really pretty much required of you at some point, but that you can basically do in whatever order you want. In other words, the game is kind of self-defeating in the fact that it puts together these side quests for you to explore and do at your leisure, and then pretty much demands that you do them. And when you do pick a side quest to do, generally speaking, it's going to either be a dungeon crawl or some sort of fetch quest. It ends up being little more than busy work, with a bunch of characters who you couldn't really give a crap about even if you tried, and side stories that have absolutely no bearing on anything that you're doing at any point throughout the game. They are entirely arbitrary, and when you go back to the main quests after you have done these particular side activities and generated enough renown, you find that the main characters themselves really aren't that interesting either, and by the time you finally get to the end of the game, you find an anticlimactic conclusion. Which of course begs the question of why you even bothered continuing the story in the first place. You're given one of 3 arbitrary options in basically the only actual choice of the entire damn game, and it has basically no effect on the actual game world. And you know what's really funny? Right on the back of the box, and I quote, "Choose your own path to glory and experience how those choices change you and the world forever." The appropriate term for this is bullshit. Remember how the original Fable advertised, "For every choice, a consequence," and it actually didn't have any consequences for your actions other than how you looked? Which, if you were a good guy, you basically started glowing and became angelic, whereas if you were a bad guy, you started growing horns and looked demonic. Guess what? Same exact thing here. It changes your appearance, and it changes the appearance of the dog that is your companion. When you do good things, you look more pleasant. When you do bad things, you look more like a friggin' demon. And your dog's fur color changes depending on your choices of good or evil. That is the entire extent of choice and consequence in Fable 2. It changes how you look. That is not role-playing, and I am incredibly sick of people saying that this is a role-playing game. It's not. It's a hack-and-slash action-adventure game that has a few light RPG elements. That is all. So that, of course, leads me into how this thing functions as a hack-and-slash action-adventure game with a bunch of open-world and very light RPG mechanics. The combat aspects, which are a gigantic chunk of the game, I might add, are incredibly bare bones. You have 3 attacks, each of which is bound to a different button. Melee is bound to X, ranged attacks are bound to Y, and magic is bound to the B button. Should you decide to use melee, what you're basically going to end up doing is hammering the X button until things fall over, and occasionally you might have to do a power attack to knock something off balance when it goes into a defensive posture. The ranged attacks consist of either just tapping the Y button over and over and over again until basically you've managed to defeat whatever is in front of you, or holding the button and going into a sort of aim mode where you're able to cycle between targets very quickly, fire shots off very quickly, and if you have upgraded the skill enough, you can actually start targeting lesser parts of the particular enemy that you're shooting at. For example, if you want to go for a headshot, you can do sub-aiming and go for the head. And this is also a way you can defeat certain boss monsters that have very specific attack points that you can go for. It's pretty straightforward, although the aiming itself actually ends up being kind of fiddly sometimes. It feels really sluggish, in particular. so you don't really get the degree of control you'd like over it, let's put it that way. And then there's the magic, where you can either tap the button for a quick cast that's at very low power, or you can hold the button down in order to charge up the spell and basically unleash an area effect. You do have a variety of different spell types that you can mess around with, but I stuck with shock magic the entire game, and I found out something very, very quickly. Magic is overpowered as hell in this game. You get shock leveled up to the maximum, you do a charged area effect blast of it, and pretty much anything around you is going to just disintegrate. And you can cast the magic as much as you want. There's no mana or anything like that. It's just infinite casting. So magic is completely broken, and when you get to the other two attack modes, you find that they're also messed up in their own ways. Melee is just tedious as hell because all you're doing is hammering the X button until things fall over. There's no finesse to it. There's no trying to do any sort of combos or special attacks or anything like that. It's just hammering X until things die. The ranged combat becomes a non-issue once you get access to the more powerful firearms, which allow you to just completely lay waste to everything in front of you very quickly, particularly once you get the access to the Clockwork Guns, which have a pretty high rate of fire and a high ammo capacity, even though they don't do quite as much damage as other types of guns. They're still just flat out better than the others because you have more shots to put on target, and those shots can't be blocked. So guns and magic are pretty much overpowered, and melee is just boring. And what that ultimately means is that the combat is just really, really easy. Basically, the only way you can actually die in this game is if you completely ignore the plethora of healing stuff that the game gives you for free, if you blatantly ignore the readily available resurrection files, and if you basically just stand in the middle of a group of enemies and do literally nothing. So right off the bat, the three primary things about this game, the main plot, the combat system, and the side quests are either just broken, like the combat, or poorly written and poorly executed like the side quests and the plot. So what does Fable II have aside from that? Well, you can make your character get a job in order to earn some money, and the way you do that is you go up to a particular workplace and you engage in a short minigame, which is basically just pressing A whenever the game tells you to press A. But eventually that won't become a problem if you decide to get into real estate, because that's where you make all your real money in this thing, and you can make it very quickly and very easily simply by owning property and leasing it out. It's incredibly easy money, and all you have to do is just sit there and wait for the money to roll in, and eventually you're going to be swimming in so much money that you won't have anything to spend it on. Once you've managed to upgrade your weapons all the way and you picked out an outfit that you particularly like, because there's no armor in this game, it's all clothing that just affects your attractiveness rating, you're not really going to have anything to spend money on unless you just start farting around and buying all of the food and all of the potions that you could possibly want, and then just messing around with things. Character customization options are relatively limited, so there's only so much you're going to be able to do with any of the stuff that you can find in the game anyway. And so the jobs quickly phase themselves out, and even the real estate phases itself out eventually. So you might end up going around and looking for other things to do. For example, you might want to get your character married, which is actually fairly amusing because you can get married in pretty much any town you want. And it gets kind of funny because not only does this barely have any effect on the game whatsoever, but it also allows you to get married in basically every single town to a different person, and the relationships are based entirely on infatuation and sex. In other words, they mean absolutely nothing. It's just yet another pointless, stupid mechanic that they decided to throw in here and didn't really think things through all the way. So what else can you do? Well, you can wander around and find all the silver keys in order to open special silver key chests, which have some slightly better loot in them than the normal chests do, which is basically just, here, have a healing potion, which is totally what you want after having dragged yourself through an entire dungeon and found a chest at the end only to have it containing a f***ing healing potion. Needless to say, the loot in this game is pretty terrible, and there's no loot in any of the crates, so don't bother crushing any of those. But apart from the silver keys, you can also go into demon doors and solve the puzzles that they give you, which are very, very simplistic, and that might get you a slightly nicer bit of loot than normally, but it's still not worth it, so why would you even bother? Well, I guess you can always just go over to the Crucible and fight a bunch of things in that arena in order to just do the same exact thing you've been doing for the past numerous hours of the game, which is just fight things. Or maybe if you get bored enough, you'll just want to run around the towns and slaughter every single person there. The point being, there's really not that much meaningful content in this game. Once you get past the main quest and the side quests, all you're left with is a bunch of collectible hunting and very bland mini-games. Which of course means that once you finish the main quest line, there is no reason to go back and do any of the stuff that you missed. And there's certainly no reason to start a new game as a different character, partly because you only get one save file per Xbox account, which is just plain baffling, but mostly because the decisions you made throughout the game are completely arbitrary and have no real effect on anything. The only real effect you see is in how your character looks, and how a few people might interact with you. Some people might run away from you because you're scary looking. Some people might be attracted to you and flock to you because, oh look, you're basically glowing. That's pretty much it. Most of the things you find in here that aren't really seen in other games are completely throwaway things. Like when you eat too many pies or too much meat and you get fat. Or you eat more fruits and vegetables to make yourself thinner. And speaking of, this just amuses me. There are stats for purity and corruption in this particular game. You gain corruption by doing things like eating meat or drinking alcohol, and you gain purity by eating basically fruits and vegetables. And the only effects these have are in how fat or thin your character is, and what initial level of attractiveness you have for certain NPCs. That's it. And this game got praised by PETA for doing that. And once you get past all those pointless, non-content features, you find that the game just has absolutely no depth whatsoever. And on top of the lack of depth and the lack of meaningful content in this thing, and all the various issues I've already mentioned, there's all kinds of other weird problems as well. There are a few bugs here and there that never really got ironed out. Navigation with the map is a bit clumsy sometimes. The menu screens and the inventory in particular are a pain in the ass to navigate. The interactions you can have with NPCs are downright pathetic. It's basically just an emote that you can do. Outside of the hub areas, the map design is just a bunch of corridors. The actual interactions with various objects in the world can be a bit clumsy sometimes because you have to position yourself just right for certain things to work properly. The game is plagued with frame rate problems up the wazoo, where it actually interferes pretty significantly with the gameplay sometimes, simply because your frame rate will start hitching when you're in the middle of doing something that requires some timing, like for example the jobs, and it will screw up your timing. And even outside of contexts like that, when you're just wandering around or you're fighting things and the frame rate starts chugging, let's face it, that's never a good thing, ever. And then there's the co-op mode, which they had to patch in after release, I might add. And the game is clearly not built around this, even though they promised it for quite some time before the game's release. All the second player can do is basically aid the first player in combat. They have no bearing on the plot whatsoever. It still plays out pretty much like player 1 is player 1 and player 2 doesn't exist. So what ends up happening is you use the other character for combat assistance. They basically become your henchmen, and they're completely unnecessary because the combat in the game is already easy as hell to begin with. So even co-op doesn't save this thing. And for the life of me, I cannot remotely figure out why people enjoy this game. It is one of the most vapid, soulless, boring experiences I have ever had in the entirety of my time gaming. And I started gaming on Atari 2600. And this game was constantly pulling in scores of 8 and higher out of 10 from the mainstream gaming critics. People constantly acting like it's this amazing experience. People saying that it was the best game of 2008. Are you f***ing serious? This is not remotely the best game of 2008. It has basically no redeeming qualities outside of its sense of humor, which is very hit or miss. Some of the jokes are actually pretty funny. Some of them fall completely flat on their face. In fact, the majority of them fall completely flat on their face. And more of the humor is annoying than anything else. So what ends up happening is you have, at best, a guilty pleasure game. If you enjoy it, fine. I can't remotely figure out why you enjoy it, But whatever, that's your prerogative. As for me, I give it a 1 out of 5. Instead of fixing the problems that the original Fable had and actually delivering on the promises, what we get instead is a wildly overhyped game that does not deliver on really any of its promises, and ultimately ends up being a badly written, poorly designed, buggy mess of a game that for some reason still got a huge amount of praise, probably just because it was directed by Peter Molyneux, not because it's actually any good. But you know what, if you do enjoy this game, whatever, that's fine, you enjoy it all you want. But I'm pretty sure we can at least agree on one thing. At least it's not Fable 3. But that's a video for another time. Thanks for watching.